discrimination is discrimination in which an individual or family is treated unequally when trying to buy, rent, lease, sell, or finance a home based on certain characteristics such as race, class, sex, religion, national origin, and status.
Perhaps even in the 21st, there was no more practiced advocate of housing segregation than the city of Chicago. Its mayors raised neighborhoods and segregated public housing. Its businessmen lobbied for racial zoning. Its realtors blockbusted whole neighborhoods, flipping them into black to white and then pocketing the profit. Its white citizens embraced racial covenants. In the 50s, no city had more covenants in place than Chicago. If you sought to advantage one group of Americans and disadvantage another, you could scarcely choose a more graceful method than housing discrimination. Housing determines access to transportation, green spaces, decent schools, decent food, decent jobs, and decent services. Housing affects your chances of being robbed and shot, as well as your chances of being stopped and frisked. And housing discrimination is as quiet as it is deadly. It can be pursued through violence and terrorism, but it doesn't need it. Housing discrimination is hard to detect, hard to prove, and hard to prosecute. Even today, most people believe that Chicago is the work to organic sorting, as opposed to segregationalist social engineering. Opportunity Starts at Home is a long-term, multi-sector campaign to meet the rental housing needs of the nation's lowest income people. This is a national campaign that was started in Washington, D.C. and will continue to help Americans from civil rights veterans and homelessness. The Housing Act was passed in 1968, and very broadly speaking, segregation has measurably declined. It became more and more effective in 1988, among other things, raising penalties and giving the DOJ more powers than it previously had. Nonetheless, post-1968, segregation and house discrimination did improve. At the same time, through pre-1968, segregation casts a very long shadow for a reason. It represents a massive destruction of wealth.
A study and report done by the National Fair Housing Alliance, NFHA, shows how this is prevalent in today's society. Housing discrimination comes in many forms and has been uncovered in a number of different types of housing transactions. It is important to note that, while the data reported here represents the number of complaints filed in the United States, this data is only a small representation of the incidence of discrimination in the housing market, because housing discrimination often goes undetected and unreported. It is common for victims of discrimination not to report discrimination because it is difficult to identify, because they think nothing can or will be done about it, or because they fear retaliation. In 2015, there were 27,944 reported complaints of housing discrimination across the country. Private fair housing agencies received 70% of those cases. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, 5%. Fair housing assistance programs, 25%. And the Department of Justice, 1%, because they are limited in the types of cases it may investigate and prosecute. The chart and graph provide a different look on housing discrimination. They break up the same national data by protected class. The chart is divided into the categories of race, disability, familial status, sex, national origin, color, religion, and an other category. The other category includes cases that did not fit into one of the major categories as shown. The graph below shows the percentages of cases and their category that each respective organization received.
50 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act, racial discrimination in housing is as pernicious as ever. Redlining is to refuse someone something because they live in an area that is considered poor or at risk. It creates invisible lines and restrictions that sector off certain groups and people within certain areas. A report released this February by the Center for Investigating Reporting, based on 31 million records, showed that Black and brown people are routinely denied mortgages at rates higher than whites. Redlining persists in 61 metro areas, from Tacoma, Washington to St. Louis, Missouri, and from Mobile, Alabama to Camden, New Jersey. In addition to this, it is impossible to compare the economic outcomes of Black and white children because they come from such different neighborhoods. A Black neighborhood with one of the highest incarceration rates, West Garfield Park, has a rate which is more than 40 times higher than the white neighborhood with the highest rate, Clearing.
An article by Monarch Housing News states that there are more difficulties on not having housing. These include access to education, security, and availability to food. The gap between rent and incomes is becoming bigger and bigger, which does not help families with minimum wage jobs, and that's all the support they have minus welfare. The campaign also addresses Opportunity Starts at Home that will help, through federal priorities, to families to have access to a safe, decent, and affordable housing in neighborhoods that have equal opportunities to thrive and live much like other communities. This campaign will provide aid to people experiencing job losses or other economic shocks to avert housing instability or homelessness.